Hello and welcome to the Life in Recovery podcast, episode 86 with me, John Loxley. I hope you're doing well. This episode of the podcast is with an addiction treatment counsellor named Suzanne Thistle, who is also the author of Chem-Free Sobriety. And I hope you'll agree that it is a really great and varied conversation. We touch on the subjects of abstinence, psychedelics, and all sorts of different types of counselling. So yeah, I hope you enjoy listening to Suzanne and I as much as I enjoyed speaking with her. And just before we jump into the podcast, please remember that if you go to patreon.com/lifeinrecovery, you can support the podcast financially.
I grew up on Cape Cod. My first, up until I was 12, I was on the Cape in Massachusetts, which is on the East Coast. Things were okay. My parents got divorced when I was really young, and my dad moved up here to New Hampshire. And my older brother and sister started to get in trouble with alcohol and other drugs, so they moved up here with him. And when I was 12, I started to get in trouble too. And so he said, "You come in with me." And so I moved up here when I was 12. And I went from a school of 200 kids in 6th grade through 12 in I went from a suburban kind of life to a very rural area where, they had to stop the bus to let the cows cross. And there were only 12 kids in my class, and nobody partied and nobody did drugs. And so I took a leave of absence from that, I guess you could say. So that was 6th grade. So 6th, 7th, and 8th grade were fairly normal, and my father got married to a woman who became my stepmother, and she and he led a pretty normal, I do quote unquote, normal life up in New Hampshire here. And so I didn't, we got up, we went to school, we came home, we had dinner at a certain time, we went to bed at a certain time, it was fairly normal. My dad was a really hard worker, and I didn't get into any trouble until I went to high school. And in high school, I started to meet people who liked to party. And that's where things started to take off. And I think about it today, and I think about, wow, we could be helping so many people if we really reach out to some of these folks in high school, teenagers, it's just when it all starts. It started off where I was, I didn't drink in high school because I thought they could smell it. So, but I smoked pot and did other drugs. And then I, after a while, after a couple of years, I really stopped caring whether or not anybody could smell it or not. And I barely passed high school. I barely made it through high school. I was absent a lot. I was partying a lot. I was taken off. I ran away a couple times. And my dad still took me back. And what's interesting is he got sober when I was a teenager, and he's still sober today. He's been sober over 40 years. And he didn't know what to do. I mean, back then they really didn't know what to do. And so his philosophy was, if I stay sober, I'll be an example and she can get sober. He didn't try any interventions. He didn't know what to do.
How, how did he get sober?
He got sober through the 12 steps, through AA.
Yeah.
And he tried taking us to Alateen. And if anybody doesn't know that, Alateen is for kids or family members teenagers who have a family member who's an alcoholic or a drug addict. And my brother and I would get stoned and go. We didn't learn much. But I suppose that's his way of trying. He tried to take us to therapy too. So I guess it sounds like I didn't think he tried at all. He did try. Now that it's come back, we had a blind therapist. It was very interesting. But it didn't work because we were just so lost and already getting lost in our addiction. And really what we needed to do is get thrown into a rehab. But I think they probably thought that we weren't addicted. That, we were just teenagers. Most people thought, oh, they're not addicted as teenagers. So I just kept kept drinking, kept using. After I got out of high school, it got worse and worse and worse. And to tell you the truth, I don't even remember having an address. I was going places I didn't want to go, doing things I didn't want to do, and saying things I didn't want to say. It was not a good life to be living. And I wanted to go to school. I started to go to college, fresh out of high school, and I had an 8:00 class. I actually did fairly well, even though I was wasted all the time in high school. I passed, and I did fairly decent. And even when I was going to college, I was doing well, but I just didn't want to show up. It was too much to be there at 8:00, So I stopped going. Something had to give, and that was it. I always wanted an education, and I couldn't do it. And I wound up living in a bunch of different places and having a bunch of different crazy jobs, cleaning, and I was, just a bunch of different jobs, and just in lots of trouble, getting into trouble. And I started to get, I would get dressed up to get messed up. That's what I heard one time somebody say that, and I'm like, yeah, that's what it was. It all looked good until you had that 10th drink and you just didn't care anymore. And then one day I was sitting in the Common. It's a little circle here in Plymouth, New Hampshire, and it was the night after. Well, back up a little. Near the end of my drinking, I met a guy at a bar and got pregnant and married him 2 months later. I had absolutely no idea who he was, but I wanted a baby, and so I didn't want to abort her, and my thought was, this logical thinking that was going on at the time. My thought was I should marry him because, this is his baby, blah, blah, blah. And on the way to the wedding, my dad said to me, you don't have to do this if you don't want to. Now, my dad's mom is like a saint. She's passed away now, but she was an absolute saint and a very Catholic woman. And he said, my thought was, oh my gosh, I can't believe he's saying that. His mother would never agree with that. But anyhow, I married somebody I didn't know, and it was mostly about, oh, it's going to be a party, and we're going to get gifts, and we're going to drink, and and he was a cocaine dealer, and so I was doing a lot of cocaine and drinking a lot of alcohol and smoking a lot of pot and smoking a lot of cigarettes. I can't even believe I'm alive today. And the last night I used cocaine, I was snorting lines I never shot up, not to say that what I was doing wasn't as badass, but I snorted a lot of cocaine, and my nose was bleeding, and I kept doing it anyways. Insanity. And, and I had this little baby that I had to take care of. What kind of craziness is that, right? And so, that next morning, I was in the Common in Plymouth, sitting on one of the benches there and contemplating suicide. I should die. I should kill myself. Well, and she'll be all right. She'll be with her father. And then I thought, well, I should go to rehab. I don't want to leave her for a month. These are all the crazy thoughts that were going on in my head. And while I was sitting there, and I can't remember if I asked God for help at that time or not, but God was always kind of in the outside, because my grandmother used to bring me to church growing up, and my mother brought me to church, and so I knew there was a God. I just didn't pay any attention, right? But anyways, all of a sudden, I was feeling the worst I had ever felt in my life. And this girl came up to me and she started talking to me about going to 12-step meetings. And my first thought was, oh my God, I can't believe she's admitting she's going to these meetings. Because it was that's only for really bad people, But I decided to go with her, and it was out of town. It was 40 minutes south of here. So I thought, good, nobody will see me, they could see me drunk and wasted and, but they can't see me sober. So anyways, I started going to meetings with her, and it was kind of weird because her and this guy, we went to his house, but he lived across the street from the meeting, and they would get stoned. They would do bong hits. I'd be like, yeah, this doesn't seem right. I mean, if we're going here to quit, and in my mind, I thought I just needed to quit cocaine because that was my problem. But, I walked into the meeting and I started going once a week with her, and I started to see people talk about having a really good time, and they were smiling and they were laughing and they were talking about they're not doing any drugs and they're not drinking and they're doing well, and all of these trips they're going on, and people going to school and good jobs. And I'm like, wow, I want that. I looked good, at least I thought back then, but the inside of me was an absolute mess. My mind was a mess. My health was certainly not good. I mean, I ate organic food and, took vitamins and, oh my God. But I was taking drugs and drinking and smoking cigarettes and all this stuff. And anyways, little by little, I started to hear messages that, bring the body, the mind will follow. That's the big thing. Going to support groups and just showing up. I don't have to be a brain surgeon. I don't have to, I don't have to think. Because I had so much anxiety when I first came. I couldn't even sit in a restaurant because it was just too overwhelming when I stopped using. And it didn't take long after that I realized I can't drink either. I can't take all these mind-altering substances and expect to live a happy and healthy and productive life. And so I stopped. But the anxiety was outrageous. I mean, I went to the hospital twice in my first year of sobriety because I thought I was having a heart attack, and they just thought it was a panic attack. Oh my God.
I experienced that as well in my first year of sobriety.
It's awful. And so my next book is what I wish I had when I was first sober, but we'll talk about that later. But so I started to meet people, and I was so anxious that I needed to be around people all the time. And that's what they told me to do. Just keep coming, keep showing up. Eventually you'll get it. and I did what they said because I didn't know how to live life. I had no idea how to live life on life's terms, and so little by little, I started to work on the 12 steps in my life, and I worked with a person who it was really great because she was working on her mental health license. I started counseling. I went to counseling for 3 years and had done some other counseling for a few years after that too. But I read everything I could read about addiction because I wanted to know what and why did this thing have such a hold on me.
Mm.
And so I read everything I could, and I started to change. I started to work on myself. Instead of trying to fix everybody else, I started working on myself. I started following the advice of people that had gone before me, and I kept going to support meetings so that I could feel supported by people and not feel alone. And I didn't have to isolate. And because I had to give up all the folks that I drank and drugged with, and so it was kind of lonely. And so I really latched on to people. Which, through COVID, it's interesting to hear people talk about, never having gone to a support meeting and only having done it online, which is a new thing. They have a lot to look forward to when they can get out there.
Yeah, definitely.
But and the other thing is I started to work spiritually on my life. I started following a spiritual path. And, I brought God back into my life and have really developed that spiritual path in my life. And that's been incredible, absolutely incredible. I went back to school. I went back and got my health degree. Health education, wellness management is what it is. It's a management degree in designing, implementing, and evaluating health programs. And then I went back and got my master's in counseling psychology with a substance use disorder concentration. And I got that because I wanted to write and I wanted people to read what I wrote. But when I started going, we had to do counseling. And so when I was doing the counseling, I was like, oh, wow, this is kind of cool. So I did it for a long time. And then I got involved with agencies. I was, a therapist for many years. And then I became a manager of substance use disorder services. And then I was a clinical supervisor and then the executive director of a couple agencies. And so I've been in the profession a long time. I've been sober. This month will be 34 years at the end of the month. So it's my sobriety month, and I just keep connected to people who are sober. Most of my friends are sober, and I don't put myself in places where it jeopardizes my sobriety. I continue to live a spiritual life. And now I'm writing about it. Now, while I was the director of the last agency, I was starting to see a lot of medication be doled out to people who didn't need it. I mean, like a 19-year-old who said, he'd only been using a couple of years, and they said he had to be on methadone for life. I'm like, what? And so it just kept compiling. And, we've been doling out medication for a long, long time, and we still have not reduced the numbers. But my thing was I started to see a lot of people die, and a lot of people die at the hands of a prescription pad. And so I'm like, and then we started seeing a lot of money come in for medication to cure the problem they had with medication. And I'm like, they're not giving it to anybody that does abstinence-based programming. And I just felt like abstinence-based program or natural healing has really taken a back seat, and it doesn't have to. And we have to remember that there are thousands and thousands of people that get and stay sober without medication. And I'm talking about addictive medication, opiates, benzos, stimulants, all of this crap that, not to say that some folks may need a bridge, but the book I wrote is called Chem-Free Sobriety. There's 101 people in there, and not one of them believes that people should be on it for life. And I know that has been debated since day one. That's not to say, hey, if you want to use it for life, you go right ahead. But here's some folks that choose not and are living really healthy and productive lives. And it's up to people what they want to do. I just felt like it was taking a back seat, and we need to put it back out there. It's almost like if you're sober without medication, you're being shamed, there's like this reverse shaming. They say, well, blah, 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 you shouldn't be promoting that. Well, no, wait a minute. Yeah, it works.
Well, there's I work in the services myself, so I've been in substance misuse services for the past 7 years.
Yeah.
And I started off as a drug and alcohol counsellor, and then working in prisons, and then I'm now a manager of a team in the community. And my take on it is quite simply that there's two different, recovery and treatment are two completely different things. When somebody's on a prescription, Ficeptone or buprenorphine prescription, that is treatment as far as I'm concerned. And if that person never comes off that prescription, then they're never in recovery. That's my opinion on it. Because
there's so many different perspectives on it.
Yeah, but the thing, when it comes to the word recovery, you begin to recover once you come off the substances. A prescription is essentially, again, in my opinion, it's like a small band-aid covering a gaping wound.
Right, exactly. And you guys are in the UK, and recovery has always been that until the past maybe 5-10 years here in the US. If somebody is doing heroin and they want to stop doing heroin, but they still want to drink, or they still want to use cocaine, or smoke pot, they're in recovery, because they're in recovery from heroin. So it's totally changed. It's changed the game. It's a game changer here. It's just you don't. Can
I just say, I think that the problem is, and this is where there needs to be a global shift in thinking about addiction and recovery. I think the problem for me is that, if somebody says to me, talk to me about your alcoholism, I would say that I'm recovered from the hopeless state of body and mind of alcoholism. I'm absolutely recovered from it. I don't drink. I don't think about drinking.
Right.
The state that alcohol got me into, I no longer live in. But I would say that I'm in recovery from the spiritual malady, because the spiritual malady is something that is ongoing for the rest of my life. So I'm in recovery from that for the rest of my life.
Right.
But you can't start recovering from the spiritual malady until you put the substances down. And this is where I believe that the shift has to happen, because if you're, it depends what your fellowship is as well, doesn't it? Because if you go to NA, for example, there it's all about abstinent from all mind-altering substances. If you go to AA, it's abstinence from alcohol, and they suggest not using any other substances.
Right.
There isn't one concrete rule across all 12-step fellowships.
Right.
And another thing to throw into the mix as well is that you've now got psychedelic therapy, whereby psychedelics aren't addictive, and they actually can help people with the mental health issues. And I personally am an advocate of them as well, because I've actually used them in my recovery. So it's a very, very grey area, this whole thing at the moment. I think the barometer for me, and I've talked about this a lot on the podcast, is the barometer, as far as I'm concerned, is peace of mind. It's like everybody on a gradient, everybody's got a level of obsessive, compulsive, addictive traits, and on a gradient, they've also got a level of peace of mind. And I think the further down the line towards absolute spiritual enlightenment that you are in terms of your peace of mind is the barometer as far as your recovery. That's the way I look at it on a personal level, you know, because unfortunately there's never going to be one size fits all, is there, when it comes to this?
No, I think
there's always going to be different opinions. Yeah, absolutely. So it's a difficult one. I was completely and utterly in your camp of like totally chem-free recovery until 4 years ago, and that was the first I went on an ayahuasca retreat, and you know, I've got to be honest with you, it was literally the single biggest spiritual experience I've ever had in my life. And given the fact that it's not addictive in any way, shape or form, because obviously I went there 4 years ago and I've never done it again since, and I'm not planning on doing it again since. It was a huge revelation for me, like a massive, massive revelation. And it actually, in one night, it was the equivalent of having, I'd say, probably 10 years of psychotherapy. So, you know, that was when my mind changed on the psychedelic front. But as far as things like methadone are concerned, and using cocaine or any other drugs, that's something that, you know, I'm not interested in doing whatsoever. So I'm kind of like I'm walking a bit of a different path at the moment. I mean, what are your thoughts on the psychedelic thing?
Well, my question is, are you expected to have a flashback at all?
What do you mean?
A flashback? With psychedelic drugs, you have the possibility. There's a couple of things with psychedelic drugs. One, you have the possibility of having a flashback where you could be walking down the street and all of a sudden it's as if you are doing that trip all over again. So you don't take the drug. It's just, I had a guy that one time said, you know, I'll just snap my back and I go right into a flashback. I'm like, wow, I never heard that before. But
what was it? What had he taken?
I can't remember what he was taking, but he was probably mushrooms or something like that is what comes to mind. It was a long time ago. It's like 15 years ago. I can't remember exactly. I haven't had too many people that I've worked with that have had, you know, that really were doing a lot. I mean, there's not many people on the planet that do a lot of psychedelics. But it takes you away from reality, and that's the part that makes me nervous. Is when you think of people who are addicted, or people that when you use, a lot of times it's to escape, right? It's to escape and not be in who you are. And I'm very familiar. I know there's like this that's been around for a long, long time, treatment for psychedelics. I know they've done it in the back rooms. What's scary to me right now is you've got pot being used to help people with addiction. You've got, you know, they're really pushing opiates to treat people with an opiate addiction. You know, they're talking about stimulants to treat people. There's so much money to be had right now because of the addiction problem, and it's expected to get they're expecting to be more in I think it was like in 2022 the need for therapists is going to be, you know, every year it's going to be astronomical how many people we need to treat these folks, because there's just so many drugs out there to treat. You know, they're being used all over the place, and I try not. I'm not judging anybody that wants to try anything, and I'm very curious to I mean, that would be the only thing that would freak me out is, first of all, is it being used to escape where you are, or are you going to have a flashback from it? What?
Well, just to address that, I think first the two things are, the first one is I think the language is quite deceiving really, because when we talk about psychedelics, I wouldn't call them drugs. I would call them medicines, dependent on what you're talking about. I mean, if you're talking about LSD that's been cooked up in a factory, then fair enough, that's a drug.
Right,
If you
right.
look, if you're talking about ayahuasca, like actually, in the Peruvian Amazon, that is not a drug. That's definitely a medicine. And there's many other psychedelics that fall under that umbrella. And when you talk about getting away, getting away from reality, I think it's actually the flip side to that. I think that psychedelics show you reality. I mean, when I went and did my first ayahuasca experience, what I went there for was to understand what was my actual reality, because I'd lived my life, believing at a core level that people didn't love me, and that deep down, everybody kind of said that they loved me and that they liked me and stuff, but I just didn't believe it at a core level, and that was one of the main reasons that I went there. And also at the time, my current fiance, who's the mother of my daughter, we'd been split up for about a month or so, and I really wanted to know whether we were meant to be together, and I just couldn't see the wood for the trees, so to speak.
Hmm.
And during that experience, it completely and utterly showed me the reality of my situation. And as I said, it was like having 10 years of therapy in one session, and that feeling of not kind of, not feeling loved or whatever, just completely dissipated. So for me, like, that was, and also prior to having this experience, I was really, really worried about it. Like I was kind of like thinking to myself, I'm going to like, am I throwing my sobriety away? Am I going to end up relapsing as a result of doing this? And I had a massive synchronistic spiritual experience just before I was about to do the ayahuasca, which for me kind of helped me to realize that I was exactly where I was supposed to be at that particular time. And the whole experience was absolutely wonderful and magical. And you know, it's very. I mean, I wrote a book about it called "Together: An Ayahuasca Experience," and it's really, really, really difficult to explain to anybody. It's the same as, like, I'm sure you would agree, having so many. And congratulations on your 34 years, by the way. It's amazing.
Thanks.
I'm sure you would agree, having 34 years of sobriety, that you can't explain spiritual experiences to people, can you? Like they've just got to have them themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same with this. It's the same with these psychedelic experiences. I could sit with you for hours and hours and hours and explain to you in detail what happened, how it helped me, etc., etc. But until you experience it for yourself, it just wouldn't, you wouldn't be able to kind of feel it in that way. And as far as flashbacks are concerned, I haven't had any flashbacks whatsoever. I've had nothing that even. I mean, I understand what happened, and I feel what happened, but I can't really remember it. Like I can't kind of like go through it in my mind. It just isn't there anymore. It was just something that was massively, it was just a big experience. And then I processed it for a few weeks afterwards, and then that was it. And then it kind of left me. And then 2 years later, I had an experience with psilocybin magic mushrooms. I went into the woods with a friend of mine and had a spiritual journey with him, which lasted about 6 hours. And again, I haven't done it since. It was an amazingly cathartic experience. There was nothing addictive about it. It was very much about processing my emotions. And I haven't, I would definitely do it again, but the opportunity hasn't arisen since. And I don't feel like it threatened my sobriety in any way. So, you know, it's all about personal experiences, isn't it? Like I'm not saying that I'm an advocate for everybody to go out and do psychedelics, because I'm definitely not, and I don't think they're right for everybody. But I think that if you feel like you've got the calling to do it, and you're confident enough in your own sobriety that this isn't going to lead you to picking up other drugs, then, I don't see any problem with it personally.
So 2 years ago, you did the psilocybin?
Yeah, it was, 2018 it was, yeah.
Yeah. And what prompted you to do that?
Well, after my ayahuasca experience in 2017, I think that was, I was more open to the idea. And a guy that I'd met on that retreat, on the ayahuasca retreat, I became very good friends with him. And he just said to me, anytime you want to do mushrooms and give it a try, just let me know. And I just wanted to try it. I just wanted to see, if it could have any beneficial kind of therapeutic effects for me, and it did.
Yeah. So,
I think I should also mention as well that this didn't just happen as an overnight whim. I mean, I researched psychedelics for about 3 years before I made the decision. And when my friend initially suggested to me an ayahuasca retreat, somebody who was in recovery, I was like, absolutely no way would I ever do that. I said it's a relapse all day long, and I wouldn't even consider it. But because I was writing a book, which was actually about what you mentioned earlier about bringing, the 12 steps into schools, basically. It was called Addiction Prevention, 12 Steps to Spiritual Awakening. I had this chapter in there about psychedelics, and that was when I first started to read about it and learn about it. And then it was just like, when you just get a calling to do something, it was like, it just from within, there was just this, my inner voice was just saying to me that this was something that I needed to do. So I kind of went with it.
yeah. Huh. Yeah, I'm not, I can't say I would advocate for that. Everybody does their own thing, and that's cool. Whatever anybody wants to do, and if you feel like that's your path and that's your calling, then so be it. My concern is, of it, there's a couple of things that go on in my mind. If you don't need to, why not do it? If you can find the healing without a medication or without a drug, why not choose that path? And
I totally agree with that. I mean, I think the reason why I did it at the time was because I wanted to know whether, I mean, you think about all the people that come into 12-step fellowships and leave. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of people that try it and just don't stay.
yeah,
And I think one of the main reasons why they don't stay initially is because there's all this talk of God, and there's all this talk of spiritual experiences and spiritual awakenings, and they just don't understand it. They don't. I mean,
yeah.
and I was, when I first came into recovery, I was like, I don't get it. I don't understand what they're talking about. And I was an atheist as well at the time.
Oh,
And through working the steps and my experiences, that changed. And, I came to believe in a higher power of my own understanding. But what was always nagging me was, I used to think to myself, if these people had a spiritual experience before they came into recovery, would that potentially change the way that their recovery went? And because I'd had quite a big spiritual experience a year before I came into recovery, so I was already open to the idea of a higher power.
yeah,
And my conclusion from doing the psychedelics and everything that I've read on the subject is that it is absolutely undeniable. If you do a big enough dose of magic mushrooms, or if you do one ayahuasca retreat, it would, without a shadow of a doubt, convince you that there is a higher power. There's no getting away from the fact. So that was my reason for doing it, and so that I could, if anybody ever asked me for my opinion on it or advice on it, I'd be able to say exactly what I just said. That if somebody can't get recovery through the 12 steps, if they went and did that once and then went back to the 12 steps, they would be open to it, I believe.
Yeah, well, I guess my other thought is there another way, though? Is there another way to get that same experience without having to take a medicine or a drug? Because I'll tell you, I was over in Israel, not far from you there, last year, right when they locked everything down. And and our kids were like, "What are you doing? Get back home!" Um, but just being there, being the presence of, like riding down the road that St. Peter saw Jesus, and it just was amazing. And the feelings that come over you when you do, and I'm not saying that, you have to do it the Christian way, but there's so many ways to experience spirituality and belief in God. I mean, just looking out at the lake or the mountains. I mean, how does that abundance happen? And energy work and meditation and there's a lot of different ways to experience spirituality. Music, Wayne
Yeah,
Dyer.
I completely agree with that, but I think when you're dealing with people who are in the absolute depths of despair,
Yeah, I mean,
like
yeah,
at rock bottom, like they're not going to be looking at a mountain thinking that's beautiful. Like all they're thinking is, when's my next bag of heroin coming from?
right, right.
And to give somebody like, you know, as I said a minute ago, like if you think about the amount of people that try 12-step fellowships and don't stay, like I mean, I'm still a regular member of 12-step fellowships, and I've been observing them for the last 10 years, and there's more people come and leave than come and stay. And it's just a real goddamn shame because the truth of the matter is that it absolutely works for anybody that's willing to work the program. Like that is a definite in my mind. But there's just, when you're dealing with people that are at rock bottom, that are really, really stuck,
Yeah.
it's just another option for people, I think. And I'm not saying, like, I agree wholeheartedly with you that there's many different ways to experience like spirituality and spiritual experiences,
Right.
and I've the kind of good fortune of experiencing lots of different types of spiritual experiences that are psychedelic based, and I've written about those as well. I just think that in the same way that that you're a Christian and you have that belief, I think that we all have to remain open-minded about it. Like, I suppose the frustration that I have is that it's not something, like, I talk about it very openly on this podcast, but I would never go to a 12-step meeting and talk about this at a 12-step meeting because I don't think it's appropriate. And I think that people aren't open-minded enough to these ideas. But what I get frustrated about is that in this world of recovery, I feel like we need to be more open-minded to this idea because ultimately it is a viable option. And if it's going to save somebody's life, then surely it needs to be investigated and, investigated further, which obviously it is being investigated heavily at the moment. But I just hope that the pharmaceutical companies, similar to what you were saying earlier about, there's a lot of money to be made. The problem is the pharmaceutical companies are probably just going to try to turn this into a money spinner.
Oh,
Um,
definitely will.
and it isn't about that. It's not about, just preventing people from having mental health issues. It's about facilitating a spiritual awakening, and they're two very, very different things in my opinion.
Do you think it's a lasting spiritual awakening? As a
Oh,
lasting
absolutely.
spiritual.
Absolutely, yeah, of course it is. I mean, it's something that, like, it's it's something that it's a spark, in the same way that any spiritual experience is. I mean, no spiritual experience lasts, does it? Like, I've had spiritual experiences through meditation. I've had spiritual experiences through sitting on a park bench. I've had spiritual experiences through psychedelics. And the common denominator is none of them lasted. They were the longest spiritual experience I've ever had lasted about 3 or 4 days. and then it passed, and then I went back to feeling exactly the same way that I'd always felt. And there's that part of me then that wants to chase the spiritual experience, and wants the next one and the next one. But ultimately, even though it doesn't last, long term, it still gives me a new perspective on life, and it still gives me the knowledge that that there is serenity to be had. And that's something that I think you get that through a psychedelic or through natural means. I mean, what do you think?
Well, one of the things I'm thinking of, because there's data that shows that the physician health program here in the United States has the highest success for treatment and through abstinence, whether it be alcohol or other drugs, and it's based in 12-step. But when you look at who they are and what they have to lose, there's a good reason for why they say, you know what, I can't let this take away my livelihood, and but it's a different group of people, right? And so you have the people that are medicated the most are the people that just can't get it, right? So they put them on medication, like you had said earlier, right? So if we think about those people who just can't get it and have had trauma after trauma after trauma, and if I faced reality, I'd be a mess, right? First of all, we have people living in the streets. We have people that can't afford to, especially with this COVID thing, looking at all these people that can't afford food insecurity happening all over the world, a lot here in the US anyways. And I think of our government, and how can our government step in, and so that people don't have to resort to other things because they are so downtrodden. What can we do as a society to help these folks? Food and housing and clothing, and I can't remember where it was, and it may be over where you are, where they have housing for people, and there's not these folks who are drinking and drugging and they're out sleeping in the streets. It's interesting, wherever I've gone, I've seen different aspects of how the government treats the folks that have a substance use disorder, and there are places that you can go to, and I'm trying to think, is it Denver? Maybe Denver, where you don't see people sleeping in the streets. And but I still think we have a long way to go. I think the the government has a lot to do with people not being able to reach, because when you think of it, like with Suboxone or methadone, you can't think, you can't feel. Those are two things that does for you, which is good if you've really had a lot of trauma, and you need that bridge to get to sobriety. But part of why you do that.
Sorry to just jump in there, because that's the key word, isn't it, Suzanne? Is trauma. I mean, ultimately, when you're talking about any addiction, you're talking about the medication for the trauma.
Right.
Yeah. So how do you get?
For some, not all of them, but for some.
Say again.
Not everybody needs medication for trauma.
No, what I'm saying is that we use our addictive substances and behaviors as a means of medication for our trauma.
Right.
So,
right. But why is that? Why is it we don't do it for physicians, but we do it for people who are on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum? And part of that is they don't have the wraparound support that doctors have. The doctors have more financial means, they have more
Yeah.
support. You
Yeah.
know, I think we need to really look at that. Like, why are we medicating everybody when we should be giving them wraparound care, you know?
Yeah, and the point I was like kind of about to make about the trauma thing is, how do you do that? So I agree wholeheartedly with you. Like, you've got a massive population of people that don't have the financial means to get the wraparound support. They are suffering from horrendous childhood trauma, and from the
Right.
research that I've done, I don't know whether you will agree or disagree, but from the research that I've done, it tends to be that people who go further down the line, heroin, crack cocaine,
Yeah.
NPF use, they tend to be the people that have suffered the worst trauma in childhood. How do you how do you even get that person to look directly at their trauma in a safe space if they're not
Right.
willing to join a 12-step fellowship?
Well, and I'm not saying 12-step fellowship at all is the answer to these folks. I mean, that's great if they can get that, but and this book that I wrote is not a 12-step. I mean, there's a lot of people in there that have done the 12 steps, but there's other means of recovery in there.
Yeah,
Um, but what I actually teach about drugs at a college nearby, and have been doing that for about, well, 14 years, with the exception of a couple semesters. But um, and one of the things I do is have them look at different types of different theories on addiction, right? So you
yeah,
hear it's a brain disease, so we got to medicate him, right? You also may hear that it's a disease of disconnection, that we're not connected, you know,
yeah, yeah,
that there's no, Bruce Alexander did a study where Rat Park, I think he's the one that did Rat Park. Have you ever heard of that?
yeah. Of course, yeah, yeah. I wrote about it in my book. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So, people just want to be loved. They just want to be loved. And so, and I know that's simple, and that's not all there is, but being able, there's a guy here who runs a bunch of treatment facilities, and one of the things he does is he goes where they are. He goes where they are, and he's given scholarships to people to go through his program. One of the women is in this book, and she's friggin' amazing. She was one of those who she was living in a shed and taking a bath in a pool, a little kid's swimming pool, those plastic swimming pools, and she was just living a real, and I can say in her words, disgusting life. And it wasn't until somebody took notice and said, "Look I'll give you this for free. Here, go to treatment. Here, have some housing. Here, make sure you eat right." Putting all of that wraparound care together for her. She's now been sober quite a long time, and she's a miracle. So there's many ways to skin a cat. I don't know why anybody ever said that. But
Horrible phrase.
I know, think of it, right? But there's many ways to get to the place that we need to get to, and and I've heard, what is success? Success is what you want it to be, right? So where do you want to go, and how do you want to get there? And that's up to you. I just want to say that the book Chem Free Sobriety has 101 people from 101 different walks of life. There's folks from all different, there's a judge in there, there's a commissioner in there, there's a hairdresser in there, there's heroin user, there's meth users, there's alcohol, people who have been sober from alcohol for long. There's starts with 1 year to, I think, 49 years is in there, and most people are over 10 years of sobriety. But they all started with something, and they chose to live a life without alcohol or any other drugs. And And there's a couple in there that are on an antidepressant. One of them has been on an antidepressant for a long time. The other one I think was weaning off at the time we spoke. Um, but anyways, it's great because it gives you their story, but it also gives you what they think, how they stay sober, what they do on a daily basis to stay sober, and then advice to people who want to stay sober. And then they also give advice in the back of the book. There's a bunch of information on what they think lawmakers and decision makers should do. So it really is a good book. It's available in audio and I don't know about you guys in the UK. I know I make less money from you guys, but the audio book you can download on your phone or whatever. And there's Kindle. It's in Kindle too. So it's really a great great compilation of different people from all over the place, that all over New Hampshire. It's all people who live in New Hampshire, or at least live here part-time, at least 6 months out of the year. So full or part-time, live in New Hampshire, all over New Hampshire, and don't drink, don't use drugs, and they tell you how to do it. So
it's interesting that you mentioned about antidepressants. I mean, so what's your thought? Do you consider that not to be what I don't know what word we're using here, clean, sober, what do you not consider that? Because I'll ask you the question first, and then I'll give you my take on it.
Yeah. So when I wrote the book, it wasn't about, it was about addictive drugs, and mostly Suboxone, methadone, benzodiazepine, stimulants, those things that people mostly abuse. Yeah. And don't, so that's really why I wrote the book. Do I agree or disagree? I mean, I had tried taking an antidepressant. I just don't like the way it makes me feel, and it changes you. And can people get and stay sober without mental health medication? Yeah, they can. Yeah, there's natural ways that you can work on yourself and stay sober without taking a pharmaceutical medication. Some people, again, we go back to trauma. There's some folks who have had some real severe trauma, and that's totally valid and understandable. Sometimes it takes a while, and they may need something, and that's up to them. And do I judge it? I don't judge it. I don't, like I said, everybody has their path. They can do whatever the heck they want. I'm just saying, I know that, this way of life works, and it's been a wonderful life. And I, have some great friends and people that I know. I'm so forever grateful to have not all these people I knew. I mean, they were word of mouth referred to me by other people, and the northern part of New Hampshire, I had to track down a couple of people up there because it's so desolate up there. There's, it's right by Canada. So, but I found a couple people up there in recovery and was able to get their take on it. And the next book I have is called God is in the Attic, and that'll be out. I was working on it today. It's killing me, the formatting. But that should be out hopefully by Monday, I'm hoping. And that's really what you should do in the first 90 days if you want to live drug-free. So hopefully that'll be out soon. It was supposed to be January, but it never made it.
They never do they? Never make it on time. I'm still waiting for my book to be published. It's probably going to be about another 8 or 9 months yet. So.
Which one is that?
I've written a book called All is One, The Science and Spirituality of Consciousness. It's going to be, I wrote it, finished it about 6 months ago, and I thought that it would be published by kind of summertime, but I think it's going to be a bit longer than that. They just take the time, don't they, the publishers?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
on the anxiety and antidepressant medication,
Yeah.
I used to be very much like when I was in early recovery and I knew nothing about anything. I was like totally against it, and I was like, it's just a crutch and all the rest of it. And now, similar to what you just said, then like I certainly don't judge anybody that's using antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication, but I think that there needs to be a plan of how long you're going to use it for and how you're going to get off it, because it's great for an interim period to kind of stabilize a person who's like really really struggling, but there has to be some sort of plan to come off it and to learn to live a life abstinent, and to, I mean, ultimately, what we're talking about when it comes to, and I know we were kind of like went off on a little bit of a tangent when I was talking about the psychedelics, but ultimately, what we're actually talking about is an ability to deal with your emotions, isn't it? Like
Right.
when you break down what Bill Wilson and the first AAers wrote about the spiritual malady, they're talking about emotional problems, and when we go through the 12 steps or go through any type of therapy, whether it's counseling or smart recovery or whatever the case may be, it's always boils down to emotion management and emotional intelligence in my mind. Like you have to learn to be able to sit with your emotions, not react to your emotions, process your emotions, and respond to them in a healthy and mature and responsible way.
Right. Right. And in my next book, God is in the Attic, there's a whole chapter on balancing emotions naturally. So people can look forward to doing that. There's so many ways. I mean, antidepressants are great, but there's long-term studies of how exercise actually is as good, if not better, than an antidepressant.
Mm,
And anti-anxiety medication, I get real nervous because those are so addictive. They actually, benzodiazepines are usually your Klonopin, Ativan, not Ativan, Klonopin, Xanax, those sort of things. They just this year made the drug companies put that it's addictive even if taken as prescribed. It's
yeah,
habit forming.
yeah,
So, and there are other ways. There's other ways. Like I learned after a while that not melatonin, passion flower, skullcap, these kind of herbs that you make into a tea settle your nervous system. Well, I wish I had known it because I was so anxious and depressed everybody is, right? When they first stop
mm,
using drugs, everybody is.
yeah,
And I started seeing a naturopathic doctor when I stopped using, and she was able to help me um, learn what things you can use instead of a benzodiazepine or an antidepressant. So some of those are in the book as well. Um, so there's two books to help people.
Oh, well, thank you very much for your time. It's been lovely talking to you, Suzanne. And where can my listeners find you online?
Oh yeah, so I'm on Facebook, Suzanne Thistle, and Instagram, naturally dot sober on Instagram. And the books you can get on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Gibson Books. So those are out there.
Cool. Lovely. Well, thanks again. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I will leave you to your beautiful life up in Northern America.
Nice talking to you, John. You take care of yourself, okay?
Yeah, you too. Thanks a lot, Suzanne.
All right, take care.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thanks for listening, and if you've been affected by any of the issues discussed in the podcast, please see a range of mutual aid organisations in the show notes. Also, don't forget that you can support the Life in Recovery podcast by visiting patreon.com/lifeinrecovery. Peace and love, and goodbye for now.